This podcast is brought to you by Customplan Financial Advisors, Inc., an independent insurance managing general agency in Canada. Financialpodcast.ca was developed with one goal in mind: to educate Canadians on important topics that affect their financial well-being and make it readily available to all. We welcome you to plug in and learn with us. If you have questions, please email us at contact@financialpodcast.ca.
Hello, and welcome to the Financial Podcast. My name is Gary Poyer. The Financial Podcast is brought to you by Customplan Financial Advisors, an award-winning managing general agency that provides exceptional support and resources to the independent financial advisor. Please visit customplanfinancial.com to see the resources that Customplan provides for you, the independent financial advisor. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we'll all encounter at some point in our lives, either for ourselves or for a close friend or a family member. And that topic is funeral planning. And I'm happy to have with us from McInnis Holloway Funeral Home, Kathy Cloutier. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you for having me, Gary.
Kathy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh boy, I'm, as you mentioned, my name is Kathy Cloutier. I've been a funeral director with McInnis and Holloway Funeral Homes in Calgary for, I'm going to say decades. I won't say how many years, but it's a long, long time. I went into funeral service after being widowed at a very young age. The funeral director who looked after me was kind and compassionate, and I thought, you know what, having been through this, maybe I had something to offer. So that's what led me into funeral service. And my story is just one of many as to how and why people come into our business. But that's my story. And I've been privileged to have served many, many families at a very difficult time in their lives. And it's a very gratifying profession.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. You know, Kathy, in the past, when I've spoken to clients about life insurance or whether or not they have wills or powers of attorney, I find that they often become uncomfortable and they would rather talk about the product itself rather than the reason why we're talking about the product. What has your experience been when it comes to speaking to people about death?
Gary, people are very reluctant to talk about death. It's an uncomfortable subject. And for some, it's like, if you talk about it, it might make it happen. However, I can assure you, it's a lot easier to talk about it before there's a death. When a couple is well and healthy and they come in to talk about what their needs are or ask questions about what can or can't be done, it's a lot easier to talk about it than to wait till there is a death. And oftentimes it's a sudden death and there's been no planning. So as difficult as it is, and I'm the first to admit, people do find it to be a trying subject. But I promise you, once they come in, when they are well and talk about it, they usually are reassured that they've done the right thing. They usually are very comfortable with it when they leave.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. And it's kind of interesting because it's something that none of us can avoid.
That's right.
At some point, we're either going to have to deal with a funeral of a close friend or a family member or a parent, and it's not an easy thing to go through, but fortunately there are people like yourselves in the industry that can help people out. Why don't we start with a very basic question? Kathy, what is a funeral?
So a funeral is a gathering of community to celebrate, to remember, and to honor the person that passed away, and to support the family and friends who are there. So it's a gathering of support. Yeah,
and you know what? I find that kind of interesting because I've been to a lot of funerals over my lifetime, and some of them seem so somber rather than a celebration of a person's life. It's, I guess it depends on the age of the person, but it really is a celebration of a person's life. Here's a question that I think a lot of people don't really consider, but what legislation deals with funerals, if any?
Well, in Alberta, we're governed by the Alberta Funeral Service Regulatory Board. This is a board consisting of 6 people. 3 of them are appointed by the Alberta government, and 3 of them are voted in. They're funeral directors who have been voted in by our peers. And these 6 people govern what happens in funeral business. So they license funeral homes, funeral directors, embalmers, and they inspect our facilities. They also license prearrangers. So they have a lot of power in our business and are to be respected. And we have to follow the guidelines that the law has set out for us. So it is tightly regulated. If there ever is an issue, they have the power to investigate it, and someone or a funeral home even could lose their license if they were not acting in an appropriate manner. So it's a highly respected board.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's far more detailed than I thought it ever was. So
most people aren't aware of it, that's for sure.
Yeah, like it goes back to, again, what we were just talking about, people avoiding the topic of funeral planning. So why would they think about the legislation or the licensing involved?
Exactly.
Yeah, Kathy, just this week, there was a very public funeral in Montreal for Guy Lafleur. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Guy Lafleur.
Oh, I watched all 2 hours.
Oh, you did? Okay. So that was a very public funeral. And the opposite, of course, is a private funeral. So what is the main difference, I guess, not wanting to be too obvious, but what is the main difference between a public funeral and a private funeral?
Well, the obvious is it's like Guy Lafleur, anybody and everybody could attend, even whether it's the one event you can go to, whether you're invited or not. A private funeral is when a family chooses not to have it public and they only invite those they want to attend. I will tell you, I have often dealt with people who've had a private funeral and regretted it. You don't know who might be really close to the family that you've forgotten, or maybe your son's best friend who would like to be there to support him or her. Yeah. So although I respect a family's wishes, if that's what they want, a private funeral, and for whatever the reasons are, but often, unfortunately, people regret it. It's a very lonely time to have a private funeral because you don't have the friends and community support around the family saying, we love you, we loved him or her, we care for you, we're going to be with you in this journey.
Right. So if a family does designate the funeral as being private, is it like by invitation only?
Yes, by invitation only.
Okay, that's interesting. So where does a funeral home come in? Like, what is the purpose of the funeral home?
So generally, once the death has happened, the funeral home might be the first call that the family make, and they make an appointment to meet with the funeral director. And it's our job to legally and respectfully attend to the deceased, so look after the deceased person, but also look after the government regulations. So we're going to register the death with the government as far as the vital statistics are required. We're going to provide death certificates for them and generally support the family in all their needs. So we're going to give them all kinds of choices at the funeral home as to what they may require or they may wish to have. So that in a nutshell is what the funeral home does. Kind of everything and anything you could want with dealing with death.
Okay, so there's the funeral director, and how many other employees would be involved in a funeral?
So there's funeral director, there's embalmers, there's administration, of course, support staff, musicians, you name it, celebrants. So if people want someone to officiate at their funeral, we can generally have celebrants on board who can help. So there's quite a range of staff that are available at the funeral home, even right up to the drivers that will drive them in their limousine.
Okay. So the funeral director is kind of like the manager of the
funeral director is the one that is licensed and oversees what happens at the funeral. You have to have a licensed funeral director, and they're the one that meets with the family to get the information to register the death and to determine what the family's needs are. And then they have all kinds of support staff to help them do their job.
Okay, but this one's a little bit off topic maybe, but what educational background would a funeral director have?
So myself, I was blessed. I lived in Ontario, so I went to Humber College in Toronto for 2 years. In Alberta, it's the Alberta Funeral Service college, which is at Mount Royal that people go to. And it's a 2-year program, which is while you are working at a funeral home and apprenticing, you are also going to school and completing the requirements that are involved there, which is legislation, legal, grief, etc.
Yeah. Well, I would think grief counseling would certainly be a big part of the education.
Exactly. What are the stages of grief? What are the problems that you might encounter?
Yeah.
Every family is different. And although, there are the stages of grief, no one person goes through them in the same way. And grief can show itself in many phases. And depending on, as you mentioned earlier, the age of the person that passed away and the circumstances of the death, a lot of that will affect how people grieve.
Yeah. I think so. Is there a connection between the funeral home and the cemetery?
Many cemeteries are owned by funeral homes, or funeral homes are owned by cemeteries. There's quite a few, or there's several in Canada, chains that own cemeteries and funeral homes. Although I happen to work for a private funeral home and we're not necessarily connected to one cemetery, but we can certainly help the family, tell them what's out there as far as cemeteries, what the costs and differences are with different cemeteries, and make their appointments so they can meet with the cemetery. And then we coordinate the details between the family and the cemetery.
Okay. So you're not connected with just one? If somebody
No,
goes
we're
to
not
your
connected
funeral home,
with just one cemetery, no.
Okay. What about locally, though? If somebody has the funeral in Alberta, but ends up getting buried in Saskatchewan, can you look after that as well?
We can. And quite often, we may work with the funeral director in Saskatchewan, depending on whether we are driving the person to the funeral or whether we are flying them. If we are flying a deceased person, then we need to hire a funeral home in Saskatchewan to receive the deceased and to look after their provincial documentation. The alternative is we will drive them, and then they're just dealing with one funeral home. And it really depends on where it is. Like, how far are we going to be driving? Is it more economical for the family for us to fly the deceased? It really depends on where it is and what the circumstances are.
Okay. And what about if somebody's snowbirding or on vacation and passes away? Are you part of the process of retrieving the body and bringing it back to Canada?
Yeah, we always tell people when they've had a death in another country, phone your local funeral home. Your local funeral home is going to be the one that deals with the police, the coroner's office, the funeral home in the city where the person that passed away, or in the community that the person passed away. We'll get the documentation and we will transfer the deceased. We'll arrange for transportation back home. And I always say, contact your local funeral home so that you're only dealing with one funeral home. And you're dealing with a funeral home who's going to be there for you. They're in your community. So next week, next year, if you have a question or a concern, you can always deal with the local person.
Okay.
But the family doesn't have to deal with the consulate and the airlines, etc. Deal with your local funeral home. He or she will deal with all the details. And you just have to get yourself back.
Wow. That's really good service.
It is good service, yeah. They have enough to deal with if they've had a sudden death in another location. It's difficult enough.
Yeah. Well, I'm really happy that we're having this conversation then, because I think our audience is going to learn a lot about the need of knowing who your funeral homes are and having a contact person, because you just never know what might happen.
No, you don't.
But this brings up another question for me. Is it possible to bury a person legally without going through a funeral home?
Yes, by all means. If somebody chooses to do it themselves, they have to follow the legal requirements. So they would need to register the death with the vital statistics and say where and when they are actually having the final disposition, they would need to contact the cemetery or the crematorium or the mausoleum to arrange for the final disposition, and they would have to transport the deceased if they're going to do it themselves. It's difficult. It's not something, I'm a funeral director and I wouldn't take that job on myself. First of all, most of us don't have the vehicle to transport a deceased person, and most people don't have the wherewithal when there's been a death to deal with the many details that are required. But it's certainly legal for them to do it if they choose to.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in the case where, a grandmother who had lived on the same farm or ranch for, since her birth, died there, wanted to be buried there, whether the family could just, register the death, but just kind of dig a cemetery or dig a grave rather, and bury
No.
her.
No, they cannot dig a grave and bury someone on the ranch. They have to be at a registered cemetery or crematorium or mausoleum. You can't just have a grave wherever you wish.
It's not like, in a John Wayne movie where, somebody dies along a cattle ranch or a cattle drive and they dig a hole and bury them with rocks. So
no, in 2022, we do not do that.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Okay, so when there is a funeral, what documentation is involved with the funeral?
So the funeral director is going to register the death with the Alberta government. They're going to provide death certificates. We're going to get a burial permit. If it's cremation, we're going to have burial permit and the cremation permit. And then we're going to provide the family with death certificates as is needed. We also, many funeral homes help with the documentation for the estate. So the funeral home I work for, we have people that specialize in estates. So our specialists will cancel the deceased OAS, their CPP, their Alberta Healthcare, their Blue Cross, driver's license, SIN card. So that documentation is often looked after by the funeral home as well.
Yeah, that's great. And it's full service. You look
It
after.
is,
yeah, that's excellent, because a lot of people, like the executor, for instance, would think that he or she would have to look after all that. But if the funeral home does it for the executor, it makes that
a lot of funeral homes do that documentation.
Oh, that's great. Another thing that I've learned. Now, when it comes to the costs of the funeral, a lot of people will think about the casket or the cremation process. What other costs would be associated with the funeral?
So the cost of the funeral is going to be dependent on professional services that we provide, the facilities that we provide, the vehicles that we provide, the casket or cremation container. There may be an urn. If it's cremation, we need to put the cremated remains in something. If it's burial, there's a casket and there may be a vault. About half of the cemeteries in the Calgary area require a vault. So that's more product. On top of that, there's the cash disbursements. Many funeral homes will pay the obituary, for instance, on behalf of the family and then get reimbursed. We may pay the celebrant or the minister or the priest or the musician, even the reception. So those are costs that are cash disbursements over and above our fees for professional services, facilities, vehicle, and product.
Okay. Oh. And for the average funeral, I don't know what is average, but what would a funeral range in costs?
The statistics tell us the average funeral in Canada is $9,500. But again, that average can be more or less. Yeah. And again, on top of that is going to be the cash disbursements. What does a grave cost, for instance? That's going to be over and above. What does a monument cost? That's going to be over and above the price of the funeral. But the statistics tell us $9,500 in Canada.
Okay. And at your funeral home, McInnis, Holloway, do you have like an inventory of caskets?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Oh, caskets and urns and cremation containers.
Oh, wow. Like it's not personal. My parents, they looked after their funeral ahead of time. My dad died a number of years ago. My mom's still living, but And one of the things that I want to talk to you about are prepaid funerals. And I know that when my dad died, it made things a lot easier for my family members, and especially my mom. But just before we get to that, as a financial advisor, I often talk to my clients about estate planning, but we never ever really venture down that path of funeral planning. So how would you suggest a financial advisor approach the subject of funeral planning with his or her client?
Well, I think with honesty, and like the example you just gave, your father passed away, he had prearranged. How much easier did that make it for your mom and the rest of you? Past experience. If you don't do it, who is going to do it? And oftentimes, if it's a sudden death, they need to make these decisions very quickly, where it's a lot easier for a couple if they go in together and make the decisions together before the event, like your parents did when they were well, and they can make, they're clear-headed and they're not exhausted because they've just had a death. So I guess past experience, and again, if you don't, who will?
Yeah. And, it's kind of funny though, I think the financial advisor, him or herself, has to get over that hump of not feeling comfortable talking about death. So I think maybe they should do it themselves. And
well, certainly, even if they don't do it themselves, come on in and talk to a funeral director. We do a lot of seminars, a lot of tours through the funeral home. Get to know your local funeral director. See if he will meet with a group of your clients, either in his office or her office or at the funeral home. We're happy to host an event at the funeral home where you bring in some of your clients and we'll give them a tour and talk about the various choices. At least get some education, if nothing else, about what is going to be required.
Okay, great advice. Speaking of education, so what is a prepaid funeral?
So a prepaid funeral is when we've met with someone when there isn't a death, and we've answered all their questions and done up the contract for a prepaid funeral. So when we have a prepaid funeral in Alberta, there's two contracts. One contract is between the client and the funeral home. It outlines all the vital statistics that the government is going to need when there is a death, and it outlines what their wishes are, and it outlines exactly what they want and exactly what the costs are. That contract then says those costs are locked in. Once you pay or start to pay, that contract says that price is locked in. So if the death doesn't happen for 10 or 20 years from now, nobody's going to be paying any more on that. That's the first contract. The second contract tells us where the money goes. So as a funeral home in Alberta, we can't hold your money. That's against the law. We must put the money with a third party, either in a trust or an annuity. That's where the money sits, and that's for the protection of the consumer. Heaven forbid, if you gave a funeral home thousands of dollars and they went broke or changed hands, where's your money? So they are protected by us. We do a contract between us and the client and where the money is, whether it's a trust or an annuity. I would say most funeral homes in Alberta would probably, if not all, would do an annuity.
Okay. And I guess another term for prepaid funeral is prearranged funeral.
Yep. Prearranged and prepaid. Yep. Okay. Some people may choose not to prepay. They may just come in and let their wishes be known, but it doesn't have the substance that a prepaid has for a family.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned one of the benefits being the cost, I guess, are inflation protected. Are there any other benefits associated other than, well, I'll let you go ahead and answer that question.
Other than you lock in the prices, it assures you get what you want.
Yeah.
So you list, and some people are very, very detailed. They'll want us to list what music they want, what pallbearers they want, who they want to speak. Other people will just say, look, I just want to do the bare minimum and let my family make the choices. But either way, they are assured to get what they want. And the biggest benefit probably is it's going to prevent family disagreements. Unfortunately, as a funeral director, I've seen many families that can't agree on sometimes what I think might be something very simple. And that may cause a rift to the survivors that, never heals. So if mom or dad have it written down what they want, there's no second guessing what they want. And there's no disagreement as to what they wanted. It's written in black and white.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very similar to like the healthcare directives.
Yes.
Right? Because if you make your wishes known ahead of time, what you want done, then family members, they're clear on what your wishes are. And same
Exactly.
thing prearranged. So makes perfect sense.
Yep.
Follows along.
Yes, it does.
So you mentioned a little bit about the payment of prearranged and prepaid funerals. Are there payment options available, or do people have to pay everything all at once?
There certainly are payment options available. They can pay it all at once, or they may choose to make monthly payments or quarterly payments. Oftentimes, if they're making monthly payments or quarterly payments, it is then life insured. So if you've taken a plan over 5 years, and heaven forbid the death happens before the 5 years, it would then be paid off. So a portion of the monthly fee goes to life insurance. And many, many people do it that way.
Okay, that makes sense.
Rather than the big outlay of one amount.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Earlier you mentioned you have people on staff that deal with estate planning. Do you also have people that deal with the life insurance? If somebody wants to go on the say the monthly payment plan, doesn't have any life insurance, do you have people that will sell them life insurance?
Yes. So you take someone like me, I have a license as a funeral director, but I also have a license as an agent. So I would meet with them and help them determine what type of contract they want.
Okay, excellent. Again, full service, right?
Yeah.
A to Z. So, okay, and you mentioned about the funds that you can't, as a funeral home, you can't hold funds for you have to go through a third party.
Yeah.
How can those funds be invested? Do you know what the investment limitations are?
That's a good question. I don't know what the investment limitations are, Gary.
Well,
I know we put the money with True Stage Insurance, which is an insurance company that specializes in funerals, but I've never looked at the very details. I guess if I was a financial planner, I'd be more interested. Sorry, I can't answer that question.
No, that's okay. I would think they would have to invest the funds along the same lines as a pension fund. They can't put the money at too much risk.
No,
But at the same time, everybody wants their funds to grow to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. But see, the funds earn interest, but that interest is eventually paid to the funeral home. And that's why the price is locked in.
Yeah.
And inflation is higher than interest these days. So it really is a good deal for people.
Okay. So the funds that grow, or the investment income on those funds, it doesn't go back to the client. It goes to the funeral home?
It goes to the funeral home when the death happens.
Okay.
And that pays any risen costs.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. Now, what if the client has overpaid? So let's say that I give you say a lump sum of $20,000 for my funeral, but my funeral only costs $15,000. What happens with the extra $5,000?
The money would be returned to the beneficiary, whoever the person has named as their beneficiary, whether it's their estate or their spouse. Okay. So, for instance, I've sometimes dealt with people that say, "Oh, I want to put $2,000 aside for obituaries." And when the death happens, the obituaries only cost $1,200. So that $800 has to be returned to the beneficiary, whoever that might be, whether it's the estate or whether they've named a beneficiary. So the money is always returned. Funeral home does not keep excess funds. Legally, we couldn't.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few more questions, Kathy. You mentioned earlier that as a funeral home, you're willing to hold seminars and maybe workshops. So how does a funeral home garner business? Or do you wait for people to contact you?
We wait for people to contact us. We've done a lot of seminars at various clubs, associations, churches, and word of mouth just spreads. One church does it, then another church says, gosh, we'd like to have that same benefit or workshop. And so that's how we've done it. I have to say, over the last 2 years with COVID, there haven't been many, but without COVID, generally they're pretty regular.
Okay. So there is no sales force soliciting financial planners, bankers.
No,
lawyers.
no,
Okay.
there's not.
Yeah, I guess, in a way, that is a bit of a growth industry given the demographics with the baby boom generation. But all right, but you do presentations at churches if asked to do so.
Yes, regularly we do presentations at churches and other clubs and associations and affiliations.
Okay.
That's regularly part of what we do. And even if people don't prearrange after, we've at least offered them some education. The average person does not know a lot about funerals and death and planning. The average family has a death once every 11 years. So most people are not really well read on the subject. So if we can get out and talk to a group and give them a little bit of education, that's beneficial to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So if a financial advisor contacted you and said, Kathy, I'm hosting a seminar for my clients, would like you to come and speak, you'd be more than willing to do that?
Be happy to do that. Yeah. Either at your office, your boardroom, or we can bring them into the funeral home, whatever is most comfortable for people.
Okay. Perfect. Kathy, is there anything else that you want to say to our audience in closing?
So if we're talking about prearrangements, which I think has been a lot of the focus here, I will tell you as a funeral director, I've had the privilege of serving many, many families. And when we walk into the office and say, here's what your mother or your father prearranged, here it is, it's all written in black and white, and they've paid for it. I've never once had a family member say, I wish they hadn't done that. They are always very grateful that their mom or dad or family member was thoughtful enough to do it. It truly is a gift for those who are left behind. It's a final gift.
Yeah, well, it's certainly an act of love because
It is.
you just alleviated a lot of stress from your family members by looking after your funeral ahead of time. Okay, it looks like we're just about out of time. Thank you, Kathy, again for being our guest and for providing such great value and insight. Very much appreciated. Kathy, how can our audience get in touch with you?
Again, thank you for having me, Gary. The easiest way to get in touch with me is to phone McInnis and Holloway Funeral Homes or phone me personally on my McInnis and Holloway phone, which is 403-464-0044. And I'd be happy to hear from anyone, even if it's just a question.
Okay. And is there a website that people can go to?
McInnisandHolloway.com.
Okay, perfect. All right. And I want to thank once again our sponsor, Customplan Financial Advisors, Inc. Customplan is an award-winning MGA that provides exceptional service and resources to the independent financial advisor. Please visit customplanfinancial.com. This podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and at financialpodcast.ca. Please visit financialpodcast.ca and sign up to receive notifications when new podcasts are available. And if you happen to know of someone who would make a great guest, or if you know a topic that would be interesting to our audience, please let us know at info@financialpodcast.ca or contact@financialpodcast.ca. And we'd love to hear your feedback as well. Thank you again, Kathy, and everyone else. Have a great day.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Customplan Financial Advisors, Inc., its affiliates, or subsidiaries. This is not intended to serve as a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. This presentation may contain forward-looking statements. Investors are cautioned not to place undue reliance on such statements, as actual results could vary. This site and podcasts are for general information purposes only and does not constitute investment advice and is not intended as an endorsement of any specific investment product or service. Individual investors should consult with an investment professional about their personal situation, Past performance is not indicative of future results. If you are unsure about what is the best course of action for you in your financial planning, then we suggest you consult a fee-based independent financial advisor or get in touch with us to discuss your individual situation. Our phone number is 604-687-7773.